There you go.
Okay, Laura.
Greetings, everyone who's joining this session today as part of the 6th Current Business Issues in African Countries 2025 conference. The panel session today is looking at the impact of sustainable consumption on our triple planetary crisis of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. And we're very honored actually to have with us as our guest today, Prenesen Moodley, who is the Registrar of the National Consumer Tribunal in South Africa. Now, Prenesen has an extensive track record in the consumer protection sphere. He's actually served for 10 years in different capacities at the National Consumer Tribunal and has played different roles there, one of which is becoming a more technology-driven institution as the NCT in its service offerings, and also developing systems that are more responsive for the needs of consumers and businesses who make use of the tribunal. That rests on his strong academic background of an LLB and an MBA, and that gives him a rare combination of expertise from legal to strategic leadership, operational insight into the evolving landscape of consumer protection. So thank you very much, Prenesen, for taking the time to share with us your insights today on what I think is a very important topic for all of us in the world, in one world, as the United Nations frames it. If we could, Prenesen, I'd like us to run through a couple of questions and just for you to converse with us about your views on it. So the first one is, if you could talk us through what you see as the contribution of more sustainable consumption could be in mitigating the triple planetary crisis, which are those interconnected challenges that I spoke about of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. Please, Prenesen.
Thank you. Firstly, I'd really like to say that I'm honored to be here and be able to share my insights with you, and hopefully the information that I share is something that would become useful and valuable, in taking initiatives such as these forward. In respect of the question, I like to think of it as proactive, sustainable consumption. And I'll tell you why. I think about the energy crisis that sometimes we are faced with, and the difference between what can be produced versus what is being consumed, and the challenges that we face with regards to that. And then I think about the reaction of consumerism, the consumer reaction to move towards more sustainable solutions, but it is a response to a threat, whereas it needs to be proactive. The proactive sustainable consumption would have led to a prevention of issues such as overconsumption, which I find to be the challenge that we face with. So as much as we speak about sustainable consumption, the time in which it's done, the importance of how it's done, and being proactive in arriving at a solution becomes as important as the solution. And changing so effectively, what I look at is changing how we as consumers, because myself, I'm a consumer as well, so are you, how we interact with products, services, and resources. That's being key. Every decision that we make, or every purchase that we make a purchase based on a decision in terms of that could result in perpetuating harmful results, or could result in something that could be more beneficial. And really then at the heart of sustainable consumption is the consumer. And it's the choices that the consumer makes, because what the consumer does is it's shifting the demand. It's changing the idea of where the demand lay. It's forcing sustainably produced products. It's forcing less pollution. It's forcing biodiversity, conscious making decision. And once we reduce those pressures on natural resources, we incentivize cleaner production, and we decrease harmful waste, because it's not within a specific action that results in sustainable consumption. It's through a value chain, which also includes waste management, for example. And the idea of sustainable consumption is not linked for me anyway to what we buy only. It's what we buy, how often do we buy it, how do we dispose of what we are purchasing, how do we use what we are purchasing. And when you talk about purchasing as often as I have, it's got to be consumer policy that starts driving a lot of the decisions related to sustainable consumption.
And that's so critical that you're beginning to talk about policy now, Prenesen, because it takes forward for me what you were talking about with consumer behavior, which is obviously what impacts on a daily basis, as you were saying. So what do you actually see how consumer policy and law can then actually push the shift towards more sustainable consumption beyond just the behavior of the individual consumer?
No, sure. So really, it's about starting off. It's about setting standards, setting standards that can be adopted. Now, in South Africa, we have the Consumer Protection Act, and what it does is it sets standards that would be helpful in ensuring consumer protection in this country. But some of those standards that it sets, for example, relates to labeling disclosures. You know, what type of, and the most common use of it really is in terms of fabric that comes into the country, or in terms of, you know, clothing and textile that comes into the country. It's what percentage of what is utilized. But the labeling disclosure does not necessarily need to be limited only to that. It can be extended. Now, my worry, or what I see quite often happening, is greenwashing, where what is being said is not necessarily what is being delivered or what is being promised. Now, instances like that where label disclosure is a element within consumer policy in South Africa, it can be used as a mechanism to enforce against poor labeling, to enforce against greenwashing. And then also, I think if I'm looking back in the South African law that we have, the implied warranties become important. And the reason why I say that is, in South Africa, we have a 6-month implied warranty on product. We have clause related to repairs. At that instance, the consumer is given the insight upfront that this product will have a lifespan of not less than a certain period of time. When you do that, the consumer is already starting to make slightly better decisions in terms of the product's expectation. So yeah, I think in terms of setting the standards, things like that is what we've adopted already in South Africa. You know, we also look at the demand that can drive industry change. So when, again, you're looking at consumer policy and what can exist in it, it relates to the value chain, because our legislation is value chain based. It's not specifically linked to the sale of a product or to the service only. It's based on the value chain. So integrating policy measures that are designed to help the value chain become critical. So incentives, policymakers, for example, can speak about incentives for sustainable products. Now you look at South Africa and you see that there's tax incentives for solar panels are currently in existence. There's tax incentives for like your electronic vehicles that's in South Africa as well. So, but the question really is it designed, or is it being designed for sustainable as a response to a threat, or is it being designed proactively to ensure that consumption is sustainable well over the long term effectively? And
so yeah, that's very interesting, Prenesen. You've mentioned a number of policy mechanisms. You mentioned labeling, you mentioned implied warranties, you mentioned standards. You spoke about obviously the need to enforce those mechanisms where they exist. You talked about incentivizing through taxing policy decisions. And you talked about very critically, I think, the inclusion of the multiple stakeholders in the consumption value chain: business, consumers, of course, the regulatory agencies. So that's very interesting for me, because that's quite an inclusive approach to policy formulation, I would think you would argue, as well as policy implementation. Do you think, though, Prenesen, because you've been drawing on your South African experience, do you think that approaches might need to differ depending on the different contexts. So, for example, in lower income countries compared with middle or higher income countries, or for the needs of vulnerable consumers, be they last mile consumers or rural consumers or consumers with limited literacy, or in the e-commerce space, would there need to be differentiation of policy instruments depending on the context?
Most definitely. I think it's most definitely because I'm looking back at the decision that has to be made in lower income countries. I need a product. What am I looking towards when I need a product? I need a product that I can afford, that I can pay for, and often my decision is based on the cost of the product. So I'm very cost conscious. The moment I am that way, my challenge is that I will buy a product, not me personally, but we could buy a product that is harmful to the environment. So there has to be a different approach. So to make this like solutions, I think solutions that come to the table needs to also consider that there's a differentiation that exists. If we're looking at lower income countries, the solution provided needs to be something that understands the cost conscious nature of the consumer within that country. And it needs to be tailored for that. So when it comes to something environmentally friendly, it can't compete. It can't only compete on it can't only compete in terms of it is environmentally friendly. It needs to also be able to compete from a perspective of it being cost conscious for the lower income consumer. So green goods generally, I'm calling it green goods, but green goods generally come at a premium. It's what I found here that green goods does come at a premium, and it does make it unreachable. And in fact, what it does is when it makes it unreachable, it creates a separation within a country where sustainable practices is a solution for the elite, whereas you need that balancing. So that's where you have a problem because sustainability in lower income countries becomes a luxury. And it needs to not be a luxury because it's deepening the inequality that exists. And then when you're looking at e-commerce and tools within the e-commerce space, legislation, the issue that I have personally with e-commerce, or the benefit that I have, it exposes the accessibility of products. So a consumer now has the ability to go and look around and identify over a variety of different platforms the product that they want that might be available at the cost that they're willing to pay. But what the challenges with that is what if there's unverified claims or greenwashing in relation to the product? What if the imports or the imports that's being received are of poor quality? Those sort of things are now making e-commerce a little bit of a challenge. And I suppose the policy instrument that needs to be used is to enforce regulation in relation to e-commerce trade specifically, because it's different. It's something that relates to multiple countries, because quite often on e-commerce, you're not purchasing from within your country. And that being said, it does pose those challenges, and the enforcement mechanisms become a bit of a challenge, especially where it's cross-border.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think you are suggesting innovation, adaptability, and constant awareness of changes that are happening, because digitization is fast paced, and contexts need to continuously take that into account. So thanks for that wide spread of thoughts, Prenesen. You've spoken about work that the tribunal is already undertaking in South Africa. Is there anything, any future work planned around sustainable consumption, consumer education, or stakeholder engagement, or policy changes?
Yeah, so I think I just wanted to share that we have had a few cases at the tribunal that we dealt with, but that was specifically in relation to labeling violations. And what had happened is products were left without entering South Africa because of labeling issues, and Whilst the products were sitting in the water, the disputes were at the tribunal. But the reason I'm bringing it up is it was looked at within the aspect of what is consumer protection legislation saying in a narrow way. It was looking at labeling as such. Is it correct? The element of greenwashing is something that we can expand on. And I think it's something that would be looked at as the regulators take further strides within the, especially within the importing environment. And you'd find that once things like that are done, clear messages get sent, not just to the parties involved, but to the country as a whole, and the consumers within the country. That as a country, South Africa is trying to drive the idea of good, sustainable choices for its consumers. And expanding. It's about the expansion of our understanding as well. So looking forward, what are we looking to do? I think it's something that's a big question for most entities and most organizations, but it really boils down to looking at the strong level of enforcement. And I think for us, because we have some mechanisms in place already, the stronger enforcement sends a stronger message, and it can result in the changes. From a consumer education perspective, I think that's the key to sustainable consumption, because really, in whichever way it's viewed, or in whichever way it's spoken about, businesses produce for consumers. So demands placed by consumers result in the innovation of business practices, which would lead to the sustainable production of products. And I think that education needs to be at the forefront from a variety of different sectors. It's not just within the consumer protection space. You'd find it in various other elements as well, because as much as sustainability it can be spoken of on the consumer protection side, it has such a wide reaching element. I mean, I've recently met with ITAC, which is the ITAC in South Africa, which is the Trade Commission. And sustainability is key to the agenda as well, monitoring what's coming into the country. So it's not something that's limited, it's something that's much huger, and it needs to be looked at in that perspective. So I anticipate going forward, we'd be looking at working with the regulators. We'd be looking at strong enforcement. The labeling decisions that we made was strong. It was a result of a compliance notice that was issued to the company. And the compliance notice was disputed. And the tribunal was called upon to make a ruling on that. So I suppose we need to be able to support frameworks that not just encourage compliance, but proactive business practices, because that is going to be driven by demand.
Thank you, Prenesen. I hear you talking about the need for an integrated approach, multi-stakeholder, cross-border, because of the nature of commerce as it's moving. And I think it's very valuable to have shared law in action with the case that you were suggesting and sharing with us from the tribunal. So thank you for bringing it into a really practical space. Just in closing, Prenesen, any call to action that you would like to mobilize us with, just to leave us with as thoughts?
I think from the consumer, so I'll speak about it. I have spoken quite a lot about the circularness, I suppose, of the stakeholders involved. So from a consumer's perspective, I mean, there needs to be this demand for transparency coming from the consumer. There needs to be the support of responsible business coming from the consumer, which I suppose in instances where that can happen, it must happen. And there needs to be this challenge of unsustainable practices that can be actioned through mechanisms of the law. And like if you look at civil society or you look at civil society associations, they need to be advocating for the right to sustainable choices. And I think the right to sustainable choices is fully embedded in the accuracy of the information that's put in the products that's there. There needs to be a lot of education that needs to come through. From a business perspective, I think the business needs to understand that the world is shifting. We can't be reactive. We've seen what happens when we react to a situation versus when you can proactively deal with a situation that we can see that's going to present itself as a problem in the future. I mean, resources by its very nature are limited. There is constraints on resources. So knowing that businesses have the secondary duty to integrate the sustainability at every level of the business. It doesn't necessarily mean that that's their product. It needs to be sustainability from various different areas. It's post-sale services, it's your marketing, it's your logistics. It's how you moving products from one place to the other. Are you choosing the most sustainable choices? And then from a government perspective, is those most sustainable choices something that can be incentivized by policy to allow businesses to still thrive? Because at the end of the day, government also has a huge benefit in a successful economy. Oh well, not just a huge benefit. I mean, it's almost everything to the country as well to have a sustainable economy. So they need businesses to thrive. And if barriers exist, such as, like, I'd like to talk about electricity, I'd like to talk about water scarcities, etc., etc. I mean, you can even talk about mercury poisoning and fish, and the lots that government in South Africa has done in that regard as well, especially in the dental industry. I've heard of late where policies enforce dentists to limit the amount of mercury that's being used in their practices.
Right.
So you look at that and see that there's an interlink between the different stakeholders or the different players in this. There's the business, there's government to try and support the businesses in doing that. But so too, there needs to be the enforcement mechanisms, and there needs to be that education and that driving of education from different areas as well. So yeah, I think so, just to end, it needs to be said that sustainable consumption is not actually a future goal. It's a present priority. And if we don't act now to what we see going to be happening in the future, we will have ourselves in a situation where, unfortunately, unsustainability is what's going to be the word that we start speaking about.
Thank you, Prenesen. I think that's such a good point to leave it at, that urgency and that shared responsibility for all of us as consumers to act in the interest of one world and in the interest of the sustainability development goals of the United Nations. So thank you for sharing your wisdom. Thank you for your time. And thank you for motivating all of us, I think, to just reflect and hopefully take action. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura. It was just a pleasure.